Welcome, one and all, again to our federal government. Is that what we call it here? Sure. Anyway, it's Barbour's MGov Chapter 10. This is the last chapter of the Barbour book. So congratulations on making it this far. We're almost done. What's left are, I think, 4 chapters from the Katz-Nelson text. That again, the Katz-Nelson text, as you might recall, is the Titanic text, if you'll recall that from the beginning of the semester. A little denser, little thicker, a little harder to read, perhaps, than Barbour's book. But the nice thing about the way I have things set up um, is that what Barbour does in her chapter 10 here is she talks very briefly about the 3 types of policies that we will read about in greater detail in the Katz-Nelson text. So that's economic policy, social policy, and foreign policy. So from here on out, again, after you read Barbour's chapter 10, the readings will get a little denser, but look on the bright side, we're almost done, right? There's a light at the end of the semester-long tunnel here. So thinking about public policy, you can run, but you can't hide. You can't escape public policy, which also reminds me of an Enrique Iglesias song from about 15 years ago. But anyway, public policy, if I think about Enrique Iglesias, I'm going to get too distracted. But the fact of the matter is, public policy affects us all the time, right? Um, depending on what you've done today thus far, you've woken up, you've breathed air that could be a lot dirtier than it is. You hopefully have brushed your teeth with water that came out of the tap without lead, um, so on and so forth, right? If you've driven anywhere, you've directly been affected by public policies, whether that's stopping at the stop sign, putting your seatbelt on, using your turn signal, what have you, right? Public policy is everywhere. I mean, we're virtually engaging with public policy by virtue of you taking a class at a public university and watching me talk about this right now. Even though you might be at home, I'm recording this at home, but the reason we're connected to each other is because the state of Texas decided to create a university, right? Texas A&M San Antonio. So point is here, we cannot escape policies of any kind. There are public policies and private policies. The ones I've just been describing are mostly public, but there are private policies that we deal with that we're subjected to all the time by choice. And we oftentimes don't consciously or verbally give our consent to have these applied to us. But anytime you walk into a store and you walk by the sign that says, we reserve the right to refuse admission, no shirt, no shoes, no service, whether that is a store's return policy, so on and so forth, right? There are private policies that are made for the same reasons. And we need these policies to exist in society without stepping on each other's toes, without living in constant aggravation or fear for that matter, right? That's what policies do. However, it's of course not that simple. We could ask a bigger question here, and this is something that were we all in class together, we would stop and talk about for a little bit. But what are appropriate areas for government policy making, right? I think it's safe to say we all understand that we need laws to control how we drive, how traffic works. But what about laws that say regulate the sale of access to, I don't know, something like marijuana? How about something less controversial like alcohol, right? In the state of Texas, you still can't buy alcohol, hard alcohol, on a Sunday. You can't buy anything alcoholic on a Sunday before noon. Um, you know, there are lots of different rules that someone thought it was appropriate to make. Others might think it's not. I mean, dare I delve into the very topical but very controversial subject of the state of Texas and the abortion law that the state house passed in late, whenever it was, 2021, that all but made abortion practically illegal in the state of Texas. For some people, that's appropriate policy making. For others, it's not at all, right? And it's not for me to say how you should think about it, But I would like for you to think about these things, right? What areas are appropriate for government policymaking and what things shouldn't be subject to government policymaking. That's what you need to decide as a voter, and well beyond this class, right? This is one of these things that I hope that someday, 5, 10 years down the road, you might not think of me, but I hope you don't think of me, but that you think about this class and you think about what you've learned in here and how what the federal government does certainly does affect your life, right? Who makes public policy? Sorry, I sometimes click the slide before I'm ready, but I did just then. Apologies. Who makes public policy? Well, we've covered these bases, so I don't feel like we need to dwell on this now. But we know what Congress does. We know Congress uh, checks and balances the president and the courts. We can think of government bureaucracies as the Barbour book structures things stemming from the executive branch, if you will. Pardon me, I got a bit of a hiccup. Um, but it's all these branches, all these institutions of government that we have talked about at great length, right? So this is how policy is made. Let's think about, I mean, well, the details we've covered, but you remember the players. Of course, like anything in this darn country, the politics are not behind um, political policies far at all, right? When I say politics, I mean, the bare knuckled bipartisan showdown that seems to come up whenever any sort of policy proposal is made from scratch or changing current policies. But there are three general types of policies for us to consider. We'll use these terms now and again between now and the end of the semester. Redistributive policies are policies that, in effect, move money, oftentimes from the wealthiest to the poorest, right? So it redistributes government funds, right? We could think of things like, say, what we used to call food stamps, but the TAMF program is what that's called. I'll talk about this in a sec, but this is in effect, wealthier people paying taxes that benefits poor people who can't make ends meet and buy food, right? That's a redistribution of funds. Other policies are more distributive with the intention of covering everyone, but not so much with the burden falling on those the wealthiest among us, and also with the benefits not extended to only the poorest among us, right? So here I'm thinking about Social Security. We all pay into it. If you've had a paying job outside of the informal economy, babysitting or mowing yards or something. But a distributed policy like Social Security is one that we all pay into, and in theory, we're all going to benefit from. Now, we're not all going to pay in uniformly and benefit uniformly, but it's not that we're stealing from the rich, so to speak, to help the poor, not to use Robin Hood terms, but a distributive policy is just that, right? Or say, think about how education is funded. In most of the United States, that's through property tax, but there's not a cap on who can go to public schools, right? K through 12 schools. It's not like if your parents make too much money, you have to go to private school, right? Right. We're trying to just distribute education evenly to everyone in the country. So I hope I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I hope that's clear, the difference between redistributive policies and distributive policies. Both of these types of policies differ from regulatory policies, and regulatory policies are ones like that bigger picture question I just asked of you. What is the role of government in regulating our lives? Now, that could be everything from, again, traffic laws to the right to an abortion, right? How should the government regulate our lives, right? That can be environmental. That can be something which affects us all pretty equally. I guess not so much depending on where we live per se, but it affects the earth at its broadest. Or we could talk about things that regulate an individual's behavior, right? Whether that, do you have the legal right to consume certain drugs or not? Or even, let's say, how prescription drugs are distributed, right? So these are all regulatory policies. These are all things that whether you want to own up to it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, affect you and your life daily, right? So what could go wrong here, right? In the process of making public policy, well, a lot can go wrong, and we'll talk about that more so on the next slide. This is part one of two here. But at the end of the day, the agenda needs to be set, right? We've used this term agenda setting before, talking about the media and how the media can set agendas for us, telling us what's important, what we need to look at and focus on. When it comes to policy making, agenda setting can go two ways. It could be our elected officials saying, hey, here's a proposal, here's what we think we should do to change the law, make your lives better. Or it could be we, the people, so to speak, communicating with our elected officials to say, hey, we'd like you to do this, right? But the agenda and the setting of it uh, can really go top down from elected officials down to us, or it could go bottom up. We can tell our elected officials what we want. Beyond that, formula or policy formulation is think back to the "I'm just a bill" up on Capitol Hill. We write up the bill, draft the bill, goes into committee, and so on and so forth. Then it gets adopted as a law. That's once the bill becomes a law, policy adoption there. Policy implementation is putting it into practice, whether that's the executive branch or the government bureaucracy, putting a policy into practice. After this, at some point, someone should ask whether it's someone in a bureaucratic government office or whether it's us as voters should ask ourselves the question: how's this policy working? Should we change it? Should we scrap it? Should we make it better? Should we make it looser? And that really is, again, where politics rears its ugly head. It's not that politics was not involved in the agenda setting or the policy formulation or anything of the sort, but really determining how it works, because it's not as an objective analysis as we'd like it to be. Narratives get in the way, right? We've seen this word narrative throughout Barbour's text. It's one of the things I appreciate about her text, that she stays on narrative by talking about narratives. But let's just think of an example here in the context of complex problems and the cost of solutions. Um, Now, like any good professor of political science, I have a pretty solid knowledge of how public policy works, how it's formulated, how it should go to plan. Most of us who get a PhD in political science have studied some sort of policy. There are people who exclusively study public policy making. That's not me. My area of expertise more has to do with immigration policy, and more specifically in Europe. But since I was born in the States, I've lived in the States for a lot of my life. I pay attention and generally know what's going on and feel like I know what I'm talking about. So and this is why I have trouble with the narratives. So let's think, for example, if I were to ask you where you thought most immigrants to the United States came from between the years 2009 and 2019. Now, you'd probably say Mexico, you might say Latin America more broadly. Those are not bad guesses. However, given that most people migrate for economic reasons, and the United States went through a pretty bad downturn after the 2008 crash, so into 2009, by that year, net migration flows between the United States and the whole of Latin America were negative, which is to say, more people left the United States for Latin America than came to the United States from Latin America, again, between the years 2009 and 2019. The majority of migrants who came to the United States legally and and illegally came often initially legally on tourist visas or student visas, and they came from Asia. Now, if you've seen a globe or a world map, and I'm sure you have, to get to the United States from Asia requires a boat or a plane, right? The narrative is really what wasn't true for that 10-year period of time. So let's think in 2015, we had a presidential candidate who proposed building a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico. Now, that's a costly solution, and it really ignores the complexity of the problem, right? Again, the majority of migrants who came to the United States from 2009 to 2019 came from Asia. So building a wall on the US Mexican border actually really just creates more problems than it solves because it doesn't get to the heart of the actual problem, right? So, again, narratives, unfortunately, they matter politically because people vote according to narratives. But problems are often more complex than simplistic narratives would imply, and getting public policy right, correct, really requires that particularly those making policy understand the problem, those implementing the policy understand the problem, and those of us in the electorate. It would help if we understood the problem too. But that's why, again, to go back to last week's lecture chapter. If you're in a bubble, a news bubble that has led you to believe that all migrants to the United States come from Latin America, that's just not correct, right? And I'm simplifying the narrative there too. But anyway, the moral of the story is narratives don't really help us understand whether or not policies are successful or not. So let's shift gears here. I only have about 25, 26 slides, so I'm going to try to get us out of here faster than in weeks past, but we've got some hefty chapters coming up again with the Katznelson book. So, you're off the hook a little bit now, but things will get dense in the immediate future when we have an entire chapter on social policy. When we talk about social policy, then economic policy, then foreign policy, and we'll wrap up. So, social policy, when you hear the term social policy, we're thinking about society, right? That's what social means. These are policies that are meant to provide a minimum quality of life for everyone in our society, in our community, right? The idea is to provide for the needy. These policies are usually redistributed or redistributive, right? These are, again, if that's benefiting the needy is what they're for. The poorest among us often don't pay a penny in income tax. Or pay much less as a percentage of our income than more wealthy people. At least that's the way it's supposed to be. But usually these are also means tested, which means, as the textbook describes, you have to demonstrate a need, that you do not have the means to take care of yourself and thus need government help to do so. Many social policies that still exist today can be traced back to the expansion of the federal government under the New Deal, which, if you'll recall, was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression and the stock market crash of the late 20s, early 30s, right? I have this hyperlink here for Provide for the Needy. This will take you to, pause here, go to the Blackboard. The list is under there, or you can go into the actual PowerPoint file if you want. The hyperlink will be live there. But this takes you to yet another John Oliver analysis of unemployment insurance, which is another social policy, right? And it's one that if you've ever received a paycheck, you've paid into, right? So we're all, in theory, eligible for unemployment benefits. Not all of us, hopefully none of us would find ourselves in a need for this. But at the time, a few months after the coronavirus kicked off, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I was teaching and living in California with my wife. We got married in December of 2019, and she's not a U.S. citizen, so lots of public policies have been dealt with there. But I got a phone call from my boss, and remember, this is after the coronavirus virus crisis kicked off, and she said to me, "Listen, we might not have work for you in the fall, so you need to plan accordingly. Start looking for another job just in case, and maybe think about filing for unemployment insurance." Which is something that I never ever thought that would ever be on my radar. But I'll tell you now, I ended up never receiving any unemployment benefits, and that had to do with the fact that although I was living in California, I was a resident of Kansas because I had moved to California from Portugal a few years prior. I'm a resident of Portugal, and it's a nightmare. And because I never changed my permanent residency to California, I was still voting in Kansas and paying my taxes as a Kansas resident, California non-resident. California, even though I filled out the paperwork for unemployment insurance, denied my claim and said, "Ask Kansas." And Kansas caught wind of this from California and sent me a nice letter that said, "You haven't worked in Kansas since 2006. We're not giving you a penny." Luckily, I was never without work. My university kept me for the following year, nearly full time. The enrollment didn't drop like the university thought, but coming from a family that my grandparents weren't particularly wealthy. My parents have done very well for themselves. I've been very fortunate, traveled around. I've never, ever, ever once thought that social policy would come so close to affecting me personally, but it can. Okay, so watch the link if you want the clip. There are things that I'm sure you might disagree with John Oliver's evaluation, but social policy is there for a reason. It doesn't mean it's not without criticisms, right? The AFDC, the Aid for Families with Dependent Children, was a clunky term that had its roots in the New Deal policies of the 1930s. Pretty much existed as they were from the 1930s to the 1990s. It was President Bill Clinton. No. Uh, you know, a president who I jokingly say sometimes was the best Republican president we've had in recent memory, but he was a Democrat who very much bought into the Republican narrative and advocated for welfare reform. And I'll say more about this in the next slide or two. But it was thanks to Bill Clinton that we now have work requirements and time limits for access certain types of social benefits. The narrative is that welfare recipients are often unwilling to work, and that welfare benefits of any kind, social policy of any kind, disincentivizes recipients to work. But again, in my case, and again, an anecdote is not scientific proof of anything, but I didn't want the benefit. I just didn't want to have to ask my parents for money in my late 30s, early 40s to make ends meet, right? When I thought I might lose my job thanks to a pandemic, right? But that's not to say though that I think reasonable people would agree that you know social welfare benefits shouldn't be limitless, right? We need to recognize that some people need help, but also make sure that there are limits to that help, right? But so here, as promised on my next slide, President Bill Clinton, who was president for most of the 90s, from January of 1993 to January of 2000, he promised to end welfare as we know it and did a pretty good job of it, changing the stipulations that were on the previous slide. TAMF replaced the AFDC as welfare broadly put, direct financial aid to families in need. The SNAP program, I think I said TAMF earlier, thinking about food stamps, and I misspoke. The SNAP program, and that's an acronym for something whose name escapes me right now, but replaced what we traditionally called food stamps. It used to literally be stamps that the government would distribute to those in need. Now, the SNAP program will provide you what is in effect a debit card to go and make eligible purchases at a grocery store. But the goal of Clinton's grand welfare reform, or so as I understand it, with the hindsight of history here, uh, was to reduce the number of recipients, but not necessarily without solving the problem of poverty, right, of inequality. You keep this in mind when you read the chapter in the Katznelson book on social policy here in the immediate future. That's one of Katznelson's big criticisms of Clinton's welfare reform. This is not, or it is worth reminding ourselves that we can think of social policies in ways that also benefit corporations, right? It's not just um, individual people who are on welfare. Corporations often benefit from what amounts to welfare programs as well, whether that's price supports or tax breaks. We could even add, say, the government can impose trade barriers to prevent certain imports coming into the country that would, in effect, benefit domestic producers, corporations, right? Think about sports teams, which are corporations in and of themselves, will often insist that they get tax breaks or support public money to build a new stadium, renovate an old stadium, or they'll threaten to leave your city. That's happened to my Kansas City Royals lots of times. Ownership has said, if we don't get money to fix the stadium, to do this or that, we're gonna look for a new city to move to, right? And this is billions of dollars a year that corporations benefit from, and that's lost tax dollars for federal, state, and local governments. And what is worth mentioning as well, Barbour does in the text, there's often little oversight for these programs. There's a lot more oversight that's done on individuals who benefit, say, from unemployment insurance. If you've watched the John Oliver link, the first one that I posted, you saw this. There's a lot of oversight there, but a lot less oversight for corporations, which Larson finds to be a bit unfair. But the narrative of social policy more generally, um, you know, about social insurance or particularly Social Security. Shifting gears here as I get ready to transition to new policy area. Social Security came about in the 1930s. This is again part of the New Deal. And the structure of it was meant that working people pay into the system, and that initially in the 1930s, the purpose was to alleviate poverty, particularly among the elderly. Elderly people, and remember, in the 1930s, people didn't live as long as they did now, but oftentimes people didn't live a whole heck of a lot longer than their working life. So that Social Security was there to provide a monthly payment to prevent the elderly from living in abject poverty, right? Attitudes towards Social Security today are increasingly skeptical as people are living longer. Obviously, my last grandmother is 91 years old. My great grandmother lived to be nearly 100. Um, and we working people don't like to pay Social Security, but I like when I think about it rationally. I understand that my grandparent, or that my one grandmother left, has at least a little bit of a safety net. That makes me okay with paying Social Security, but it doesn't mean I'm not concerned about the long-term sustainability of the program, right? Because uh, as happens in wealthy societies, in the United States, we're having fewer and fewer children, and as we live longer and longer, eventually we're going to reach a point where, uh, in theory, we're going to have more retired people than working people. And what's that going to do? I mean, to sustain the system, the Social Security system as it exists right now, we're either going to have to pay a heck of a lot more, we're going to have to increase the retirement age, we're going to have to spend a lot less on other things, like maybe defense, for example. But yeah, the long term future of Social Security, its sustainability is something that I really hope that you think about. Ask your parents, how do they feel about this? According to the text, the Barbour text, Social Security might run out of money as soon as 2037. I'm not even going to be 60 years old then, right? So I'd be worried, quite worried about my, Larson's retirement program here, which is to say nothing of you all. Most of you who are, within spitting distance of 20 years old. I realize what you're going to be doing with your life in 50 years is probably not on your immediate radar, but it perhaps could and should be. Okay, shift gears a bit. Let's think about healthcare. Um, I forgot that there's another subsection here of policies to consider, and I'm glad Barbour has a small section on healthcare because although it is, I think, needlessly a politicized hot topic in the United States, it's one that I don't think we talk about openly and honestly enough. But the fact of the matter is, and I'll show you some data when we get to the point in the Katznelson chapter on this topic, but um, healthcare in the United States costs more than anywhere else. We spend nearly 1/5 of our GDP, nearly 20 cents out of every dollar spent in the United States is spent on healthcare related costs. And when you're 20 years old, that's unfathomable. You don't spend 20% of anything, or of your expendable income on healthcare, right? If anything, you spend 20% of what you have maybe on beer and video games. But healthcare will become a priority for you, as it will for everyone. I'm not getting any younger, and I can tell you every year I seem to see doctors more often than the year prior. And I've also lived in places that have universal healthcare, and I can tell you from experience, and again, this is not scientific, and I'm not telling you what to think. I think our system is needlessly complicated. and needlessly expensive because of its complication. I've wasted hours recently in 2021 dealing with a problem between the pharmacy and one of my doctors because they don't seem to communicate with each other, and that puts me in the middle to try to solve my problem, and it's eaten hours of my time this year thus far. I'm not saying that universal healthcare systems are perfect. They're not. But this link here will take you to different folks from around the world. It's only like maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes long, and it might make you chuckle a little bit, and it might scare you a little bit when folks in Canada and in Finland are presented with information about just choosing a healthcare plan, hypothetically through their employer. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. I'll leave it at that. Someday you will realize when you graduate and you get your first real job, I hope it's one that includes healthcare, and it will be a pain in your butt, and you'll be calling your parents and anybody you know in the healthcare field to try to explain the ins and outs to you. But healthcare in the United States before 2010, that was the year that Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, or you'll hear it called the ACA, was passed. Really, Medicare and Medicaid were the only federal major roles that the federal government had in healthcare broadly in the United States. Medicare is a system that provides healthcare to those over 65. People often associate it with Social Security, but it's a different public policy. But if you know anyone over the age of 65, I bet my bottom dollar that they're on Medicare, and in practice, that makes them a socialist because it is free government healthcare, right? It's private care, but it's financed publicly. So my grandmother, my aforementioned grandmother, who's very much on Medicare, she has gotten 2 hip replacements in the last year or so, paid for by you and me, right? Paid for with our tax dollars. Done in a private hospital, done by a private doctor, but that's how the Medicare system works. Medicaid is, in effect, the same thing. It's means tested for those particularly who live in poverty, right, or who have disability of some kind and need assistance to cover their healthcare costs if these people in question are under the age of 65. We could say something about the Veterans Affairs, very relevant to a town like San Antonio, but I also know for a fact that it's not that every veteran can just walk into a VA hospital and get care. It's a lot more extensive and complicated than that. But whether it's the VA, whether it's Medicare, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's just the healthcare that hopefully you have, likely through your parents' private health insurance, or the healthcare that coverage that I have through my work, these are all very expensive, right? So by 2010, as promised when he ran for president in 2008, then President Obama guided through the Affordable Care Act through Congress in 2010. The hyperlink here will take you to yet another John Oliver clip describing the ins and outs of the Affordable Care Act. Feel free to watch it if you like. If not, don't sweat it. But I probably will come back to this same link when we get to the social policy chapter from the Katznelson book. But anyway, the Affordable Care Act did change the game a little bit. It intended to give us easier access to health insurance by pooling those of us without it, reducing the risk to private insurers. But what the Affordable Care Act meant to do, contrary to what maybe the narrative you've heard about it is, it's not a government takeover of healthcare. If anything, it facilitates people without health insurance, which most of whom are those who work full-time jobs, but just don't have jobs that provide health insurance as a benefit through their job. It's meant to lower the price and facilitate private individuals purchasing private health insurance programs. That's the purpose, right? And I actually was offered a job before I took the position at A&M. I was offered a part-time position at Schreiner University north of San Antonio. And even though no health insurance would have been provided to me through that job, by law, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, HR, human resources there, had to tell me about my options in the public marketplace facilitated through Obamacare if I needed to buy health insurance, right? So that's how that works. But all the Affordable Care Act really was insurance reform. It really wasn't healthcare reform directly. That has not stopped our friends in the Republican Party, in particular, from attempting to reform, and replace too many R's and P's and F's there. Sorry, repeal, reform, and replace the Affordable Care Act. But as happens in the United States, when new programs, new supports, new rights are extended, it's pretty difficult to take them away. That has not stopped many of our, particularly Republican friends, from challenging the Affordable Care Act in court. It is true that the Supreme Court has, in effect, weakened some of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act in practice, but the Supreme Court has not struck it down. There was an attempt at repealing the bill. Candidate Trump in 2016 promised to repeal Obamacare. He was unsuccessful at that. However, in the 2017 Trump tax reform legislation, what happened there was that Congress decided to remove what we called the individual mandate from the Affordable Care Act, removed it from law. And what that individual mandate did is that for a time through the Affordable Care Act, we were required by law to have health insurance. That was called the individual mandate. And that was what was meant to drive us, to those of us who didn't have insurance, to consider buying it through the public-private marketplace that the Affordable Care Act created. So now, by law, we do not need to show that we have health insurance. Well, in theory, we do on our taxes, but there's no penalty for not having health insurance. But anyway, if you've spent any time abroad, God forbid, if you've dealt with healthcare abroad, you might have an opinion on this. Feel free to talk about it in the discussion boards if you like. But anyway, let's shift gears to economic policy. Money, of course, makes the world go round. I'm not going to ask you an essay question on the final exam to describe the differences among economic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and so forth. But economic policy at its broadest can affect any number of things in the United States. But we know after seeing inequality for all, the importance, say, of the middle class and middle class spending, any policies that in effect affect the bottom line of the middle class can be viewed as economic policy. Really, anything that has to do with government expenditures or tax policy at its broadest can be viewed as economic policy. Getting into the weeds a little bit, fiscal policy has to do with, say, interest rates that the government sets. Contrary to our belief in this free market system that we think we have in the United States, it's not, the market that sets interest rates. It's the government that does that. That's fiscal policy. Monetary policy has to do with how much money is circulating in the system. And it's the government that decides to print money or take money out of circulation, and that's monetary policy. Tax policy has to do with how we're taxed, what we pay in as individuals and as corporations. This link will take you to another John Oliver clip, I'm sure, with the obligatory tasteless PP jokes and such. Please ignore those if those offend you. But this is an interesting discussion of corporate tax policy and how most corporations do a pretty good job of paying as little tax as possible, right? Regulatory policy can, in effect, be economic. It doesn't always have to be, right? If we're talking again, and I don't mean to go back to this issue, but if we're talking about abortion policy as regulatory policy, that's not so much economic. If we're talking about, say, taxing or whether or not alcohol or cannabis or what have you should be legal to buy and sell, that's regulatory policy. Whether or not it's taxed, and it is, at least regarding alcohol, that's where regulatory policy becomes economic policy, and vice versa. So lots of different things to consider here. But ultimately, as I hope I made clear earlier in the semester, I think is into chapter 1 of the Barbour book, and hopefully, assuming you watched Inequality for All, the last documentary, you've seen that governments are necessary. Your government participation in the market is necessary. If we had an unregulated market, which is to say, if there was a hands-off economic policy and the government did nothing, then what we would probably have in the United States is just a bunch of monopolies. We think Amazon's a monopoly. We think Walmart is a monopoly. What if Amazon and Walmart were the only shops we had, right? I don't think monopolies are good for us as consumers. It gives us fewer choices, and I guarantee you that if our reality boiled down to Walmart and Amazon, we'd be paying a lot more just because we'd have to, just because these two companies could charge it. Um, we'd be paying a lot more for all the crap that we buy that, a lot we don't need. But a lot of crap we do need would cost us a lot more money. So, you know, having an economic policy that prevents the rise of monopolies from taking over the system is probably not a bad thing. I don't think I need to go into great detail. We've talked about this more than once throughout the semester, the Great Depression's impact on policy. That's where we got the New Deal. We have Social Security thanks to the Great Depression, right? We have Medicare, Medicaid, by extension, as a consequence of the Great Depression. The 2008 financial disaster had a great influence on migration, not on migration policy. On economic policy, there seemed to be a greater willingness on the part of Congress to re-regulate the banking industry, but regulation is greater now, yes, in 2021 than it was, or 2022, whenever you're watching this, greater than it was, say, in 2007, but not as much as many people think it should be, which is to say, we might face another economic disaster in the near future. I hope that's not the case. But you never know. I hesitate to say that the greater government participation in the economy means the less risk of economic collapse that we saw in 1929 or 2008. But I would like to see a bit of a safety net there for that purpose. Moving on to foreign policy here. I need to address this. Foreign policy, this is my last batch of slides. I'll try to get us out of here quickly. Policy that crosses borders, right? Policy across borders. Foreign policy might not affect you nearly as directly as the other types of policy that we've looked at thus far. But foreign policy is important to us all, especially in a city like San Antonio. I mean, when you think foreign policy, you should think about military spending. The link between economic policy and foreign policy is just that. It will be an issue come the last film that we will watch this semester called Why We Fight. The goals of foreign policy generally are three: to provide security, to provide economic stability, and then a distant third is humanitarian policy, right? What we can do to help people around the world who are very much in need. There are two fundamental perspectives on our relationship with the world, one of isolationism and one of interventionism. Past and current isolationist policies, traditionally, right after the Revolutionary War, the United States really did a good job of isolating itself from the rest of the world, in no small part thanks to two very large oceans on either coast. But it made it easy for the United States to not participate, not intervene in international problems. But we could also look at our selective isolationism around the world at present. What is the United States doing about the civil war in Syria? That's gone on for over 10 years now. What has the United States done about civil war in Yemen, which has gone on for a number of years now, not quite as long as in Syria. But we are selectively isolationist when we want to be, and we reserve the right to be as interventionist as we want to be when it suits us, whether or not that was, say, invading Afghanistan in 2001 as a response to September 11th, or intervening in Iraq in 2003, which didn't quite go to plan. But these are our two general foreign policy choices here. Worth asking ourselves the question, what's foreign and what isn't, right? Sometimes this isn't as clear as we think it is. Obviously, if you're standing at an international border, it's pretty clear what's foreign and what's not, who's foreign and what's not. But think about the environment, right? Environmental policy can very much be domestic policy, but it also very much has foreign implications. And the other side of that coin is, say, what countries like, say, China or India, very large countries that are industrializing, produce a lot of that stuff that we like to buy on the cheap at Walmart and Target and from Amazon. But how China decides to regulate or not its environment can affect us too, right? So foreign policy, what is foreign and what is domestic isn't necessarily always as clear as we would hope, right? But let's think about what actors are involved in foreign policy. And again, we're going to read a whole chapter on foreign policy, so I don't want to get into the weeds of it right now. But we could talk about intergovernmental organizations like, say, NATO, right, which maybe you're familiar with, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a product of the Cold War. It's a security agreement among most countries in North America and Europe to defend each other against an attack, right? That's an intergovernmental organization. We could talk about the European Union would be another one. The United Nations would be another one. We could talk about non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, the Catholic Church, which of course has its government in Vatican City. Now that I think about it, but can be viewed as a non-governmental organization. Really, any organized religion could be viewed as such. Multinational corporations, whether that's Coca-Cola or the aforementioned Walmart or Amazon, and the companies that make everything that those companies sell, these can be viewed as external actors, right? And miscellaneous actors as well. ... Question mark. We could think about, say, Al Qaeda, ISIS. Not necessarily good groups of folks, but these are entities that, like it or not, are capable of changing the course of history, right? And very much changing and shaping our foreign policy in the United States. So, worth keeping our eyes open and ears to the ground to think about what can affect us, whether we want it to or not, or whether we're aware of it or not, right? When it comes to doing foreign policy, the president really is the most important figure in the process, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The president is also sometimes referred to as our diplomat-in-chief, and I should have put hyphens in there too. The president, as we know, we've studied this, has great constitutional power when it comes to foreign policy making, whether that is, say, appointing ambassadors, negotiating treaties. Presidents also have a lot of informal power. Presidents can sign what we call executive agreements. We'll talk about those at greater length in a week or so. Presidents can form informal alliances. Presidents can, to a limited extent, use their powers to engage in conflict. But we know that it's Congress that has the power to formally declare war. The president has the opportunity to communicate directly with us as well, right? Remember, we talked about going public in the chapter on the presidency. Presidents, especially in times of international crisis, we often turn to presidents to tell us what's going on and what to do. George W. Bush, the younger Bush, wasn't he lost the popular vote in the 2000 election, wasn't viewed as the greatest president in the world prior to September 11th, 2001. But I guarantee you, because I was in college at that time, we all looked to the president for some direction when that happened, right? So the president definitely is the face of the United States and the face of foreign policy by extension. Not to say that there aren't other components, particularly in the executive branch, that are involved in foreign policy. We can talk about the National Security Council, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, so on and so forth. The intelligence community broadly. I think there are about 17 spy agencies in the United States federal government. So yeah, the intelligence community is pretty big. But we'll flesh out more of these details once we get to that point that in the Katznelson chapter on foreign policy. Congress, of course, has a role. Congress can declare war, to repeat the point. If a president signs a treaty, the Senate ratifies treaties. The Congress, House, and Senate approve the budget. And then I ask any possible tension here, particularly when it comes to declaring war. We've seen this, and I'll remind you, and this again will come up later. But the U.S. Congress has not declared war since World War II, right? What Congress does at present, has done for the last 70 some years, is will Congress will authorize the president to use force, which pretty much just gives the commander in chief carte blanche to do what he, and I say he because they've all been he up to now, wants to do with foreign policy, right? So there has been tension in the past, particularly after Vietnam. Things came to light, decisions were made by both Republican and Democratic presidents, and Congress has over time tried to assert itself, particularly via the War Powers Act of 1973, is meant to limit what presidents can do, uh, particularly in times of conflict, without letting Congress know. But again, we'll talk about that when the time comes. We can think about different types of foreign policy: politics, crisis policy, strategic policy, structural defense policy. Now that I look at this, I think I should have inversed the order here. Structural defense policy dictates a lot of what we see around us in San Antonio, the bases. This is all stuff that's been set in motion for quite some time. Year after year, budgets get renewed. Things happen as they always have. We could talk about strategic policy, say vis-a-vis North Korea, or say China or Russia. But the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the White House, all have different and perhaps differing understandings and approaches to some strategic, longer term issues, like what do we need to do about China? What do we need to do about Russia? What do we need to be prepared to deal with North Korea, so on and so forth. And then ultimately, too, crisis policy happens, say, when the country's attacked, right? Again, September 11th was, the most crisis-filled day I've ever lived, and that was very much a day, again, that we all looked to the president for some guidance, and our foreign policy changed drastically because of it, right? But again, we'll talk about this when we get to the foreign policy section. But to give you just a very quick historical overview, again, traditionally, isolationism is what we opted for, because the country was very isolated. And the United States, has gotten along pretty decently well over the last 200 years with all of its neighbors up and down the Americas. Not without United States intervention. I'm not making excuses for U.S. foreign policy. Please don't jump to that conclusion. But with a couple of exceptions, the United States hasn't gone out to, hasn't found itself in full-on war as it has, say, in recent decades in Iraq or Afghanistan, in the Americas. But United States foreign policy really shifted in the middle of the 20th century, reluctantly getting into World War II, and then contributing to the Allied victory of World War II, which wouldn't have happened, by the way, without the Soviets. About 27 million Russians died fighting World War II on the Eastern Front. We often overlook this in our socialization of USA, and we won World War II. Well, we did, but it was a team effort. And after World War II, we know that relations with the Soviet Union soured almost immediately, and foreign policy really was centered entirely around the Cold War, which was this nuclear armed showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. No major war came out of it. Luckily, we didn't get nuked to death, but I was socialized to be afraid of that as a child, and I definitely was. But we know the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The end of the Cold Wars brought about some odd changes. The United States, for a time, was really the world's only superpower. Economically speaking, the Chinese are right on the tail of the collective tail of the United States, and militarily now too. So, the effects of the end of the Cold War have been that Russia, replacing the Soviet Union, lost a lot of ground vis-a-vis the United States. And current threats very much include the countries I've mentioned twice already: China, Russia, and North Korea. These are the three countries I think about the most in terms of U.S. foreign policy, as being perhaps the most immediately threatening to the United States and our economic stability and physical security. But anyway, we'll get into the details of this later. I'm done for now. I think I still went on longer than I wanted to. I apologize for that. But at the very least, as I say, we're almost done. Bye bye.